All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, co-sponsored by the Hope Policy Institute and the Southern Economic Advancement Project. Before we get started, we will hear from one of my personal sheroes, Stacey Abrams.
No one ever gave me a chance to succeed. These words are uttered too often by people who were previously incarcerated. And sadly, these words hold weight and truth. According to the Hope Policy Institute, more than 44,000 local, state, and federal restrictions are placed on people leaving prison and reentering society. The Southern Economic Advancement Project is honored to partner with Hope Policy Institute to host this critical conversation on how to redefine life after incarceration in our southern states. Changing the narrative for people who have served their time. Like the one Arkansas woman incarcerated for 32 years that found herself in debt after paying her parole fees. Instead of making progress, she was forced to use a credit card to pay for bills and food because the cost of freedom was too high. If nothing is done, as many do, she will end up homeless or worse, will recidivate. Carceral debt is one of the terrible barriers to reentry. Other challenges include the inability to obtain identification, secure housing, or land a good-paying job. This is how the dreadful cycle of imprisonment continues. Rehabilitation and reentry must include creating laws and programs to assist returning citizens in sustaining and building a life after prison. And critically, financial inclusion is a vital part of that rebuilding. The organizations you will hear from today, Hope Policy Institute, Alabama Appleseed, the Southern Center for Human Rights, the Sycamore Institute, and Decarcerate Arkansas, are all dedicated to moving these after-prison problems to policies. Policies that should ease debt collection practices and prevent the accumulation of debt during incarceration. Policies that push local governments to adopt programs to provide photo identification to incarcerated people 2 months before release. Policies that open pathways to start a small business and a new chapter. Too often we see the incarcerated and returning citizens as broken, beyond repair. Instead, I invite you to help us help others pick up their pieces and build a stronger, more resilient future. Together, let's make the South #1 in giving individuals impacted by the justice system a second chance.
Thank you. So again, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Calandra Davis, a policy analyst with Hope Policy Institute, the policy arm of Hope Enterprise Corporation and Hope Credit Union. Hope Policy Institute's most recent report, examining the intersection of criminal justice and financial services in the Deep South, is the foundation for today's discussion. This presentation is rooted not only in the data and analysis of federal criminal justice related debt in the Deep South, but also in the experiences of those impacted by the criminal system. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. There are various forms of financial barriers that people face once interacting with the criminal system, which are discussed fully in the paper. For the purposes of today's presentation, we will focus mostly on criminal justice related debt, which is debt composed of legally binding financial obligations imposed on those convicted by criminal courts. We'll hear more later in the webinar from the Sycamore Institute about the impact of fines and fees in one Deep South state. Next slide, please. So let's talk about why it's important to focus this conversation in the Deep South region. 4 of the 10 states with the highest incarceration rates in the country are concentrated in this region. We often think about the criminal justice and financial system as 2 separate systems. This map shows how these systems interlock. Debt is connected to both the high incarceration rates and the high and underbanked household rates. Unbanked households are defined as not having a savings or checking account with a financial institution. In one majority Black Alabama county, Jefferson County, the state prison incarceration rate surpasses the state's rate at 627 per 100,000 residents. The same county also holds a high rate of unbanked households at 20.6%. In comparison, the national rate of unbanked households is just 5.4%. Next slide, please. There's a long, costly history that binds criminal and economic injustices. The costs and impacts are highly concentrated in the communities already stricken with persistent poverty. In 2019, people in the Deep South were burdened by more than $4 billion in debt related to their incarceration with the federal criminal system, more than double than what it was 10 years ago. Formerly incarcerated individuals pay their debts to society twice, once by serving out their sentences, and again by carrying the burden of heavy debts upon release. These debts are often used to reincarcerate people, prevent people from voting, and revoke state driver's licenses. And those of us in the South know that licenses are not just significant for opening accounts, but also for getting back and forth to work. But I will let Alabama Appleseed take a deeper dive into this later in the webinar. Next slide, please. There are severe concrete examples of the consequences of debt. The stories of those impacted by these consequences are highlighted throughout the report, and we will hear more later from our panelists with Decarcerate Arkansas, who will share her own lived experiences. The debt issue exacerbates the challenges people are facing when re-entering society. Whether those debts are accumulated before or during incarceration, they follow individuals long after their release, and in many instances, bringing them right back into the criminal system. One example of debt accumulation while incarcerated can be seen by taking a closer look at multiple Alabama counties. Incarcerated folks are personally billed for their healthcare needs, and their bills can end up with collection agencies while they have no source of income, wreaking havoc on their credit. And family members often take up the burden of paying the debt to ensure the healthcare needs of their loved ones continue. For Mississippians, the inability to pay the debts associated with criminal justice monetary sanctions often leads to reincarceration. In fact, there are 4 restitution centers across the state serving as debtors' prisons, where formerly incarcerated individuals work to earn money to pay off court-ordered debts. Though half of the people housed at the centers owe less than $3,500 in debt, they stay 4 months on average, and sometimes years, working to satisfy these debts. Next slide, please. This slide articulates the massive amount of debt overhanging the Deep South. Take a moment to imagine what else might be possible if people were paying this money towards a down payment for a home for their family, or small business startups, or even transportation to get to and from work, rather than giving this money to these extractive debt mechanisms. People impacted by the criminal system are losing out on so much more because of the barriers to access wealth building opportunities. Debt is just one small piece of the puzzle, yet we cannot solve the puzzle without tackling the issue of debt first. Next slide, please. Now that we've talked about the many barriers people face, let's talk about solutions. Policymakers must consider economic equality in their decision making to ensure the criminal justice system is less punitive and more equitable. Policies that champion debt reduction are particularly important for formerly incarcerated persons who are more likely to encounter predatory lending practices and lack access to credit. Policymakers should ease debt collection practices and prevent the accumulation of debt during incarceration. Local, state, and federal governments should set caps on criminal justice debt to waive fines and fees of low-income individuals involved in the justice system. And lastly, policymakers should prohibit the revocation of driver's licenses for unpaid fines and fees. Next slide, please. So again, I want to say thank you to all of our listeners today, and thank you to my colleagues at Hope and those with lived experiences that helped to influence this work. Next slide, please. And now I will pass it to Mandy Pellegrin with the Sycamore Institute in Tennessee. Thank you.
everyone. Thank you so much for having me here to talk about our work on fees and fines. So first, I just want to tell you a little bit about the Sycamore Institute. It is a nonpartisan public policy research center for Tennessee. So what we do is we specialize in objective and neutral research and analysis of state level policy issues that affect and connect the health and prosperity of Tennesseans. We don't actually do any lobbying or advocacy. We stick to the research and we let others make up their minds based on it. So last year, we began looking at Tennessee's criminal fines and fees. There's really been a growing interest from both sides of the aisle here in Tennessee to look at this issue, but really what's been missing is a clear consensus on where to start. Many have a fairly good grasp of some of the unintended consequences, but if they wanted to do something about it, what are the things that would make the biggest impact? How would changes affect the systems and services that these dollars fund? So our research set out to provide a comprehensive picture of what these obligations are, why they exist and what purpose they serve, who decides them, how they affect people who owe them and the governments that collect them, and then the trade-offs and the unintended consequences. And it became overwhelmingly clear to us very quickly that it's very complicated. The story of fees and fines and their unintended consequences is very much one of death by a thousand cuts, but still, I'm not sure we fully appreciated how hard it would be to untangle this knot. So for example, how much might someone pay for a specific offense? It's complicated. How does the money that gets collected actually get used? It's complicated. Should policymakers consider a complete overhaul of the system or piecemeal changes? It's complicated. So I'm going to share a few visuals to illustrate some of these complexities here in Tennessee. So on the first slide, we're going to be talking about the sheer number of financial obligations. We found over 360 different financial obligations spread across 17 of the 71 titles in Tennessee's state code. So here on this slide, you see examples of what people might face throughout an interaction with the criminal justice system. So dozens, big and small at every step: arrest and pretrial, trial and other court costs, conviction and incarceration, and then finally into community supervision. The next slide shows who all is involved in deciding any given person's criminal fee and fine obligation. So state law requires and authorizes all the obligations, but there are many local actors across each of Tennessee's 95 counties that are determining the costs that people ultimately incur, including law enforcement, district attorneys, judges, juries, sheriffs, local legislative bodies, and court clerks. On the next slide, you kind of begin to get an idea of how the dollars actually flow in Tennessee's criminal fee and fine obligations. So to the left are all the various costs, punitive and procedural. Some are owed to state agencies, local officials, and private entities. Those are the boxes in the middle. And then from there, the dollars go to victims, to state and local general funds, to the criminal justice system itself, and to other specific purposes and programs. And sometimes you even have dollars flowing between the entities that are collecting the money before they arrive at their final destination. So on the next slide, we see the flow of 10 of Tennessee's required criminal litigation taxes. So I talked about 360 in the code. This is 10 of them. So on the left, you have each tax, different amounts associated with different offenses and triggers. They're paid to county court clerks. That's the middle column there. Those clerks get to keep a cut as a commission, but those commission rates vary by tax. Those are the dark red or brown lines. And then the rest is sent to the state, which is divvied up to 16 different specific purposes. And that's what you see all the way to the right. So finally, on my last slide, you see how complicated it is for how the payments are actually allocated to a person's fee and fine obligations. So when folks make payments towards their obligations, sometimes the costs balloon based on when and how they're paying. So state law prioritizes how payments apply to various obligations, which you see in the flow chart at the bottom there. So if the person uses a payment plan, that's the second column, 5% of what they pay can be applied toward a payment plan fee. And then if they're paying 6 months past their due date, as much as half of what they pay goes towards a collector's fee, either to the court clerk or a private collection agency. And what that means is that it could take them twice as long to pay off their debt. So these are just a few of the complexities that we've uncovered so far in our work. So far, soon we're going to start digging into some of the more specific issues underlying those complexities. But I'll leave you with one takeaway. What I've just showed you grew out of decades of piecemeal decisions that somebody always thought was a good idea at the time. But the end result is a tangled web of effects, incentives, and unintended consequences. So our hope in doing this work is that we will help Tennessee policymakers understand where we are and how we got here, making it easier for them to take those first steps towards addressing any problems that they see with our current system. So again, thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to hearing from the other panelists.
For local government. For people who would say that we need these sorts of fines and fees in order to make our budgets, or in order to have these sorts of, to collect the funds, what have you identified any ways that alternatives to this kind of mechanism that are less punitive, that harm people in less ways?
We have not gotten that far in our work. What we have been trying to do is use some data that's available to us on the finances of Tennessee's 95 counties to really start to understand how much of their budgets are relying on these sources of revenues. And what we're finding is that it varies immensely, and I have a hard time believing that counties even know how they compare to sister counties right next door. So I think the first step is really understanding how reliant is each government on these sources of revenue, so that you can then begin to really understand how much revenue needs to be replaced. And then I think a really good flip side question there is this creating new costs for local governments as well? Money that they're spending on trying to collect these things, money that they're spending on keeping folks in the criminal justice system. So it's sort of this cyclical thing where you're creating new costs for yourself, perhaps because folks aren't able to pay what they owe. And sometimes they may face such an insurmountable amount that they don't try to pay at all.
Thank you so much. It's very interesting and difficult information, and we appreciate you. Our next panelist, I'm so excited for you to hear from her, is Laura Berry. Laura Berry is a leader and an activist, and on behalf of people who are formerly incarcerated. And she does this from a place of her own experience, as she is formerly incarcerated herself, and was incarcerated as a child. She's a leader in the Incarcerated Children's Advocacy Network and has done a ton of work to shine a light on the burden and the harm of criminal debt on people as they are re-entering after serving time in prison. Laura, we're thrilled to have you. I'm going to turn it over to you. Laura, I know Laura was having some sound issues. Let me just check on her. Laura, we cannot hear you. Oh no. It is okay. We will give you, why don't you take a moment to see if we can figure this out. Maybe you can call in by phone and use your phone audio. But in the meantime, Akisha, this is you're agile, right? You don't mind doing things out of order. Thank you so much. So I'm going to go ahead and shift to our third panelist, and then we'll come back to Laura. And Akisha, we're so thrilled to have Akisha Anderson here from Alabama Appleseed, where she is a legislative and policy attorney. And she specializes there in policy and policy development and legislative advocacy and coalition work. And she is here to talk about some of the amazing work that Alabama Appleseed has been doing on these issues with regards to driver's licenses and other matters. And we're so happy to have you here, Akisha. So it's all yours.
Thank you for having me. You can go to my first slide if you don't mind. But as we get there, good afternoon, everyone. As you know already, my name is Akisha Anderson, and I have the pleasure of serving as Policy Director for Alabama Appleseed Center for Law and Justice. And so Alabama Appleseed works to uproot systems that keep people trapped at the intersection of poverty and the criminal justice system. And we do this by conducting original research, publishing reports, and taking our findings to the State House to try to advance positive policy change. And so this legislative session, two areas that I'm working on or bills that I'm working to try to advance deal with the suspension of driver's licenses for things unrelated to road safety. So namely criminal justice debt, traffic debt, et cetera, and the creation of a diversion program study commission. And so I'll talk about both of those areas over the next 5 minutes. So next slide, please. In Alabama, we suspend driver's licenses for a host of things unrelated to unsafe driving, things like failure to pay a ticket, failure to appear in court, and petty drug offenses. So as is the case in many southern and rural areas, public transportation is virtually non-existent in Alabama. So if people need to get to work, to get to reentry programs, to pick up their kid from school, to get to a doctor's office, to access social services outside of the home, or even to escape an abusive home, they need a valid driver's license. And now more than ever, as Alabama experiences a workforce shortage, as well as the economic devastation created by COVID-19, we believe that it's imperative that potential workers have driver's licenses. Unfortunately, however, there are currently 100,000 Alabamians with a suspended license for things unrelated to road safety. And Black Alabamians are disproportionately impacted by this practice due to disparities in community policing and the existence of the racial wealth gap. So in 2018, Alabama Appleseed created a report entitled Stalled that explored the practice of driver's license suspensions in Alabama. That year, we interviewed hundreds of Alabamians with licenses that were suspended due to unpaid traffic debt. When speaking to these people, we found that the median amount owed was $869, which for the average working Alabamian is a lot of money to owe and a lot of money to pay. We also found that 64% of respondents had been jailed due to unpaid traffic debt. And even more surprisingly, we found that 30% of the people we interviewed had actually committed a crime like selling drugs or stealing to pay off their debt. Even more shocking, amongst the people that admitted to committing a crime to pay off their debt, for the vast majority of them, the most serious offense prior to that crime had been a simple traffic infraction. And so the way that things work now, poor people are punished more harshly simply for being poor and not because they are more dangerous drivers than people who can afford to pay an $800 or however much dollar ticket. So suspending licenses and jailing people for unpaid traffic debt and other things unrelated to road safety isn't making Alabama any safer. The punishment does not fit, and this practice is very counterproductive to all the things that we as a state say that we're trying to achieve right now, such as prosperity and workforce development. And so that's why this legislative session, one of the bills that we're working on and strongly supporting is HB 129. This is a bill that will end the practice of suspending driver's licenses for failure to appear in court, failure to pay a ticket, and petty drug offenses. Next slide, please. Another goal of Alabama Appleseed is to increase access to alternatives to incarceration and beyond the prison walls public safety solutions. So just as a bit of background about Alabama, Alabama's prisons are currently in crisis. So our history of tough on crime policies have led to us having one of the highest incarceration rates in the world, the highest prison homicide rate in the nation, and a men's prison system that is ridiculously overcrowded. So we are also in the process of being sued by the United States Department of Justice as a lawsuit that was filed under the Trump administration has argued that our men's prisons violate the constitutional rights of all the men housed in them. And so while this won't solve all of our problems, Alabama Appleseed believes that it's time for the state and agency leaders to seriously invest in alternatives to incarceration, such as pretrial diversion programs. So last year, Alabama Appleseed released an in-depth report entitled In Trouble that studied diversion programs and the user experience when going through them. We found that although diversion programs currently currently exist throughout the state, they are mostly user funded. So this means that the budget derived to run and operate these programs is derived from the pockets of the people that utilize these programs, usually low income, usually poor folks. So this essentially creates a pay to play system in which Jimmy from an affluent home and a family willing to pay $2,000 plus gets access to these programs in lieu of incarceration, whereas Joaquim from a less than affluent household and someone who doesn't have $2,000 plus to pay to participate in these programs is shipped off to jail or prison instead. So stated differently, because of our reliance on user fees, these programs currently contribute to a two-tiered justice system in which defendants like Jimmy have resources to get access to the programs, while defendants like Joaquim are sent to jail or prison instead. And so the fact that the state does not fund or supervise these programs creates a host of other perverse financial incentives as well, and leads to a lack of uniformity and oversight. There are also differences county by county with regard to who has access to these programs and how much they cost. And so as a solution to this problem, we believe that the state needs to adequately fund existing diversion programs and that user fees need to be eliminated altogether. That will in essence mitigate wealth-based disparities. And if the state is unable to fund these programs, other solutions include establishing universal eligibility and completion requirements that hopefully safeguard against the existing practice of completion being determined by whether all fees have been paid or not. The state can also codify oversight and create roles and standards that every diversion program is required to abide by in order to make them more uniform throughout the state. So one such bill designed to create roles and oversight is making its way through the legislature now. And so that's the bill that we support is HB 71. And if passed, this bill will create an accountability courts commission whose duty it is to oversee and study all existing diversion programs and also to make these programs uniform throughout the state. So again, this is a bill that we're closely watching and supporting, and one that we think will help ensure that people have access to justice despite or regardless of what their financial circumstances. So I look forward to answering any questions, and I thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much, Akisha. Can you talk a little bit about what the reception has been with policymakers to these very, very sensible, very practical solutions that you're proposing?
Yeah, so for the driver's license piece, we actually surprisingly have gotten a lot of bipartisan support. Our biggest opponent, not surprisingly, is our law enforcement agency. And so ALEA, Alabama Law Enforcement Agency, has really been pushing back a lot against the driver's license bill. And their biggest argument thus far is that they stand to lose a lot of money. And it's very unfortunate that they're saying they stand to lose somewhere between $6 to $8 million, if this practice is stopped. The truth is that they make a lot of money in reinstatement fees off the backs of poor people. And so that is something that, as we're talking to legislators, they seem to be able to get on board with that this is ridiculous. We should not be, penalizing poor people and charging them this much if they don't have money. If they don't have money to pay a ticket, if we suspend their license, that means they're not going to have the ability to keep a job, which means that they're still not going to have the money to, pay back these tickets. And so that's something that we have really received a good reception with. We are hoping that that bill has some more positive traction this session, but we're still waiting on that bill to move. As far as diversion programs goes, the bill that would create the Diversion Study Commission has actually made it out of committee, 2 committees actually, is waiting to be voted on by the full House. And so that is really good to see. I think that legislators, and we do have a former legislator who is now the Commissioner of Pardons and Paroles, who actually participated in a diversion program once upon a time. He was the former chair of our Senate Judiciary Committee. And he is somebody that, has been very vocal about knowing that these are pay to play systems. And he was someone that was able to pay to play. And so because of that, there is a lot of understanding about, the troubles with our diversion programs and the fact that we do need to do something, if not to fund them now, to at least get an understanding of how they work and create some uniformity amongst them. So that's something that I'm really excited about. And I look forward to seeing how that bill kind of moves forward throughout the rest of the session.
Good luck. We all are interested to see how that will work out. And thank you so much for your advocacy. Laura, I'm hoping this will work now. Are you able to, can we hear you? Laura, can you hear me? Okay, it looks like you're still on mute. No, we can't hear you yet. Oh, there you go. Try speaking now. Oh no. Oh, this is just awful. I want to hear from you so badly, and I know the rest of us do too. Is there anything that any of the moderators might be able to help us with here? You're on the phone, okay. Forgive us all. One of our audience members is asking Laura if you're able to type in the chat, but that's a lot to type. I wonder if there's a way we can work around this. I don't, gosh, I hate to just move forward, but I'm not sure what else to do here. We can keep working on this. Check audio settings. Sometimes there's a mute on the phone and another mute on Zoom. Do you want to make sure both of your mutes are unmuted, Laura? Oh, you all are such wonderful audience members. We're getting so many great suggestions. Headphones with a mic and calling in. I do believe Laura has tried to call in on the phone, but it's not working right now. And it does say audio connected. That is a good idea. I'm going to ask our panelists a question, and then I'm going to try to work with Laura and maybe have her call me and see if we could maybe speak through my phone or something like that. But Mandy and Akisha, I'll throw this one, and Calandra, I'll throw this one out to you too. So we are organizations, both the ones that we are from and the organizations that are leading this seminar that span the Southeast. And I often think about W.E.B. Du Bois's quote that said, "As the South goes, so goes the nation." And knowing how these sorts of dynamics, this sort of debt plays out where we are, we know that when it's bad here, that other states around the country can get ideas from the South, that things are kind of tried out in the South before they get rolled out to other countries. But at the same time, we are also of a place of incredible resistance and incredible organizing and incredible campaigning. And we've seen that in the ways that the South, I will take pride in what Georgia has done on the national sphere in recent times in elections. What would you say that we need to do as organizations working in the South, as individuals working in the South? We have all sorts of people on the audience right now. I know there are DAs in the audience right now, and I welcome some of our Georgia DAs who are here. What are your suggestions that we can do to work together to change the dynamics of the way this is playing out in the South right now?
So I think a lot of what we try to do in our work is ask very basic questions about not just the public policies themselves, but the policymaking process. And so oftentimes we'll start with, a lot of what we do is problem definition if we're not looking at a specific policy. And so we'll ask a basic question, well, if you want to use public policy to address this issue, what is your goal? So I think that's asking policymakers to step back and say, what was the goal of these things? And what is your goal for people in Tennessee? What is your goal for people interacting with the criminal justice system? And then step back and ask, is this public policy? Is this government work at its finest? And the answer is really kind of no. I mean, I think that you see a lot of bipartisan agreement on criminal justice reform because it is a really good example of where the government is not doing a good job. And so I think that's something that we're really trying to work on here is ask, like, is this what we want the state to be doing? Is it doing its job well? And I think that good government is important for people on both sides of the aisle.
I think something that Appleseed believes strongly in doing and that we do a lot in all of our reports is we use a lot of storytelling. I think that's important to really humanize the people that are impacted and trapped by these systems. And so bringing those stories to a level that's relatable to politicians and to the people that we want our work to reach is something that's really helpful and really impactful. And so I can't discount, the power of storytelling and really bringing the people that are impacted by these issues and by these bad policies to the forefront to really help, drive home what it is that we're talking about and why it is that we're talking about this.
Thank you so much. Calandra, were you about to say something? Please go ahead.
No, if you have Laura, then I want you to get to Laura first. So.
Okay, sounds good. We're gonna try this. I've got Laura on speakerphone. This is like new next level Zoom work here. Laura, let's give it a try. Say something and we'll make sure that people can hear you.
My name is Laura. Can everybody hear me?
Yay, Laura, we're so excited to hear from you. Please go ahead and share with us your thoughts and experience. We're so glad to have you here.
Okay, so first of all, thank you, Sarah, and everybody for having me and all the technical difficulties. I went to prison when I was 17. I was incarcerated for 32 and a half years. So coming home, I was not able to get a competitive salary. Starting off, I had a very low paying job with limited hours. I didn't get full-time work, so it was having to choose what was going to get paid first, my parole fee, so that I didn't go back to prison. The mountain of medical bills that the Department of Corrections did not cover for the 4 years that I was sick and in and out of the hospital while I was incarcerated. So a lot of times starting out, I had to choose, was I going to buy food or was I going to pay my parole fees and other things of that nature. So having experienced that firsthand, when you first come home, it's almost impossible to get your driver's license, your state ID, so that you can get employment and open a bank account, which is a necessity these days to be able to pay bills. So I was faced with one obstacle after another. I didn't exist in the system. My social security number, it was just non-existent. Like I had to fight really hard to get the state ID. And after paying taxes on my job that I worked at the end of the year, I filed taxes. I couldn't get my refunds because the IRS said that I was still an inmate on a work release program or in a halfway house. So for the past 3.5 years, I've fought each of those battles, and I still have mountains of medical bills hanging over my head that the Department of Corrections should have taken care of, because they contract with a private medical company that's responsible for all medical bills incurred, and they chose not to pay those. So I get the collector's bills because it's my name, not that private company or the Department of Corrections. So I can speak firsthand that I have had to choose between whether I was going to eat or whether I was going to stay out of prison by paying those bills. And of course, I'm still free and doing much better now. So obviously I chose the latter, and that was to pay my parole fees and things of that nature.
My goodness, thank you for sharing that with us, Laura. And I can't even imagine having to make those difficult choices for you individually and for the many, many other people that are impacted and that are having to make these same terrible choices. We do have a couple of questions in the chat from folks who are that I'll go ahead and ask you. One of them is, what are the campaigns to retroactively eliminate debt or get people free who are detained or incarcerated because of debt? Is the onus on the people to file to have their debt cleared, or does it happen automatically?
I have filed to dispute those bills because they were a state responsibility, but the debt agencies that it was turned over to have told me that basically in most states, the DOC is not responsible for incurred medical bills while incarcerated. So they remain my responsibility. However, in most states where that is the case, those people receive a wage for their work while they're incarcerated. And in my state, they do not.
Thank you so much. Oh, go ahead, Mandy.
So, like a lot of states, our state law does have provisions for ability to pay reviews, but I think probably like experiences in a lot of the states on this call, there really aren't hard standards for how that gets done and what it means if a judge does decide that you are not able to pay. So it varies from we do not have a unified court system in Tennessee. So it varies from courtroom to courtroom, even within a county. So, in Nashville, for example, you might have some judges that will decide that someone does not have an ability to pay at all. And so they waive all their debt. In other situations, they will waive the criminal consequences associated with the debt and just move the debt over to the civil side. So that you're still subject to debt collectors, to civil lawsuits, wage garnishment, all those things. You just don't necessarily have a criminal consequence. In some places, judges say, well, if you're able to make bail, then that means you're able to pay your fees and fines. And so basically that automatically disqualifies you, no matter who's the person paying the bail. So I think that's something that we're having a hard time getting our minds around, is how this varies from county to county and even from judge to judge. So it's certainly not equal across the state in terms of wiping away people's debts.
Mandy, while you're unmuted, we have another question about, do you know of any agencies that can help people in Tennessee deal with resolving some of these issues?
Well, I know our legal aid societies do a lot of work in this area because they are doing a lot of civil cases, and in our discussions with them, they see this with pretty much everybody they work with. They have some kind of debt, and they're working to help them through that. Off the top of my head, that's what I know. But there's certainly no like centralized state agency or anything like that. Thank you.
Another question from the audience is, what role, if any, does technology play related to alternative credit scoring or bias in different algorithms linked to credit scores?
So I guess I can take that one. And I'll say that's still a conversation that we're exploring. That will get into the fintech conversation. So financial technology is such a broad umbrella. So financial technology could either harm a community, or it could also, as in the example in this question, it could also provide some good. And I think that still needs to be explored, and we haven't really delved into that yet. But I'm very interested in really finding out what that's going to look like in the future.
I'm actually interested in kind of asking a question in that vein. It's unclear to me what kind of standard practice there is for reporting unpaid criminal debt to credit agencies. I mean, I know using a collection agency, for example, is something that local governments are allowed to do in Tennessee, but it's not consistently used. And so I'm just curious if you all have seen standard practice on that.
I don't know about standard practice, but you're making me think of a case that we just resolved in Georgia, where unpaid court fines and fees were being put on. It was a city of LaGrange, Georgia, and the city also controlled all the utilities, and so unpaid court debt was added to utility bills. So all of a sudden, your light bill, your power bill, went from your usual $30 month bill, it could go up to $1,000 if you had unpaid court debt, or $2,000. And so people were having to make very difficult decisions about paying off court debt or looking at the possibility of losing power, and then the consequences that come with that. I mean, we represented people who are on oxygen, who need that electricity in order to live. People with mothers with small children who know that in order that they need to have power to take care of their families. So, you know, while that's not exactly what you're saying, but the way that this kind of unpaid court debt can go on to just create financial wreckage and like life wreckage in other aspects that have absolutely nothing to do with the criminal legal system. Well, let me just, I know we just have a few minutes left, and thank you for all the questions that you all are sending. I really do appreciate it. Here's another question from the audience. What percentage of those who owe fines and fees or detention debt are mothers? And how does this impact children in terms of their needs and the generational impact of these policies? Which one of y'all would like to respond to that?
I will go again to say that, and then maybe Mandy might be the next best person when it comes to answering this question. So the data, especially on a state level around fines and fees, is really not there. And what the Sycamore Institute did was really just kind of like, every state could take that as a best practice. We need that to happen here in Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, because the data just isn't there. So it hasn't been broken down to who the demographics, again, we haven't broken it down that far, but we all know that there's a communal impact and an intergenerational impact. For folks who are carrying this debt that are impacted by the system, it's not just an individual impact. That, again, if they're not able to pay their bills, if they aren't able to purchase a home, then they might lose custody of their children. I know that there was a mom in Mississippi who was incarcerated, and upon her release, did not have custody of her children, could not get custody because she also could not get employment and also was struggling just to stay in a home. And so, again, the impact is generational. And that's why we have to have these conversations, not just from an individual perspective, but also from a communal, a family, and even a systems perspective.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything that she said. We don't have data on who or where or what, but in fact, we're moving towards policy options. And one of them is like, maybe we just need to figure out what's going on here. Like we need some data to understand, but you know, we kind of got brought to this space. We were more in sort of the health policy, social service policy space. And we've done a lot of work on like the opioids epidemic and adverse childhood experiences. And, you know, I think those really come to a head when you start talking about the criminal justice space, because you know, what we've seen over the last several years is that more and more folks are being incarcerated for, you know, nonviolent drug offenses, and that they have skyrocketed among women because of the opioid epidemic. So I imagine that any impact on mothers has been particularly acute in the last, you know, decade. And then something that we had tried to connect some of the unintended consequences to is the issue of adverse childhood experiences. It's something that policymakers in Tennessee care a lot about, care about families and care about kids, and kids being able to grow up and realize their full potential. But when you have, you know, parents, family members, community involved in the criminal justice system, and perhaps elongated involvement because of criminal debt, then that has a very real impact on the community and on children, you know, intergenerationally. So that's something we've kind of tried to connect those dots, but the data just aren't there to give you a hard percentage.
Thank you all. I think we have just time for one more question. And I'm gonna kind of riff off of a question in the box, which is asking about what are some of the strategies that you all have used to deal with the financial incentives that maintain the collateral systems. I would just say, feel free to share a strategy that has been effective in your work, or if you would prefer, share with us what you're going to do next with this incredible work that you're doing, and how we can stay in touch with you. Feel free to share your website. Why don't we go in order of how we spoke? Mandy.
Sort of lost track of the question there in the middle.
Oh, sorry.
So
And
sorry.
I'm sorry. And I realized Calandra actually technically.
Oh yeah,
goes
it's her
so
turn.
you're off the hook, and see if you can pick it up when Calandra goes. Calandra, my apologies.
No worries. And I will make it quick. So how Hope plans to move forward with this information and what's next for us is to really continue to listen. And this goes back to your initial question, Sarah, that how in the South, how are we doing this work? How are we remaining resilient? And we have to build off of the stories of those who are impacted. Hope really believes in we're not working for the community, we're working with the community. And we're working with those who are impacted by the system. We're working with our reentry partners who are in the communities, who are doing that boots on the ground, who's really doing that hard direct service work. And we plan to continue to do that work, but also to build off of those experiences and to continue to advocate for those policies that are necessary. For the example, those policy solutions that were mentioned earlier in the webinar. And I stop there and now push it over to Mandy.
Yeah. Okay. I know the question now. So I think I talked a little bit about our strategy at the beginning, but we just continue to work harder and deeper on this particular issue. We have sort of a broad understanding, and now we want to go a little bit deeper into specific areas. I talked about doing some policy options that we'll start putting out in the future. And I think we'll start with kind of a high level, let's think about all the points of potential intervention, everything from gathering better data and understanding what's actually going on in Tennessee and how these things that we've learned from other states or from national studies actually apply and play out on the ground in Tennessee, to starting to look at some very specific things like driver's license issues, diversion programs, alternatives to bail, things like that. And so we just continue to support kind of the goals that policymakers want to achieve. And I know I actually saw some names on the participant list that there are other partners in Tennessee that I suspect will pick up the research that we've done and kind of formulate some very specific policy recommendations from that. So.
Yeah, we're trying to sound the alarm and get as many people on the ground just aware of the way that Alabama is spending money. So we are about to spend $4 billion to build 3 new mega prisons. And we say that we don't have the money to, invest in, these other programs that could really help our citizens, such as diversion programs. And so we are really ringing the alarm to kind of get everyday people involved. We're also having private meetings with, big stakeholders who invest in the prison system and encouraging them to pull out and stop funding different prison entities, et cetera. And so we are definitely trying to address the money financing piece at the root.
Thank you so much. Laura.
We're actually right now have a bill that's in the legislative session for this year with to reduce fees connected to bond and bail and things of that nature. So we're hoping that, for instance, if you have a homeless person who goes in and pays $5 on a bond that they owe, they leave owing 10, so they ended up owing more than they were able to spend while they were there, which is what keeps them where they are as being homeless. So we have that in our session right now. It was litigated earlier this week, and so if you want to follow the success of that, because I feel confident in it, you can follow us at decarceratear.org.
Thank you so much, Laura. And thanks so much to all of you for being here today. I am so grateful to have had this opportunity to be with you and to hear from these wonderful panelists. Thank you, Calandra. Thank you, Mandy. Thank you, Akisha. Thank you, Laura. And thanks to the Hope Policy Institute and the Southern Economic Advancement Project for bringing us all together today. Please feel free to follow all of our organizations and check out the report. And we will see you next time. Have a good afternoon.